Okay, so he's here on my phone. He can't seem to join the Zoom, so I guess we'll just do this for now.
I don't know. We can explore the platforms. We are happy to move. Sorry, you're muted, Chair.
Thanks. There might be a problem with that because on the laptop I am on right now, where also opened all the Zoom rooms, I don't have Discord. But if it's very inconvenient, I guess we could also change.
No, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
All right, perfect. I guess then that's everything. So we can move on. And I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll take POIs in the chat, so you can drop your POIs there. And if you have any clarifications, please ask it as a clarification and not as a POI, given that I have a timeline for accepting POIs. Right, we'll just set up a timer. So, I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Clearly, prenups are pre-agreed towards marriage, which means the agreement that existed prior to marriage. They are triggered when breakups or the conditions for that prenup is broken, and that makes the process for redress very, very short, very, very quick, because everybody has an understanding of what is going to happen when these negative circumstances arise. What this normalization does is to destigmatize prenups. And I want to flag that this debate is not prenups versus no prenups, because on the upside, prenups exist in the way in which they exist now. What I'm going to explain is what's the difference between the normalization of prenups and the kind of prenups agreement that exists on their side. Two things then to note. A, this normalization process looks like there is, hello.
At least, yep, you were away for a short time. I had you at, I think it was 45. Okay. Like you disconnected for a second.
Just or a second.
A little bit more.
Someone was calling. All right. So do you want me to resume, or do you think I can?
Yeah, sure. Whenever you're ready.
All right, sure. Resuming in 3, 2, 1. So this normalization looks like destigmatization, given that currently people are stigmatized when they want to engage in prenups, especially for minorities or women who are vulnerable within these relationships because of like all the things about patriarchy, societal stratification, etc., and the notion that women are the weaker ones within marriage. They are seen to be greedy, right? Religious positions or religion's positions on most of these things like prenups are seen to be bad and are not religious, etc. So most people tend to opt out of them. Access, which means that during the normalization process, it's made cheaper. People are made to understand the cost. For instance, the feminist movement can hop on to subsidize these things, charities, family courts, state institutions, then establish a system where people can easily access to this, right? You can make it a prerequisite to marriage, which means a lot of people and everybody then has to go through prenups to then exist within a married status, and now it becomes widely used. What this comes with is massive education on prenups, unlike what we see now, massive public discussions and equipment of how people can get them, which best firms are there to represent them, etc., in a way that makes this much more accessible. The counterfactual is not lack of access to prenups. What exists on their side is usually prenups existing with all the stigma that comes with it, like we see in status quo, the cost barriers, the lack of understanding, the lack of knowledge about prenups, and what is the best way, or what are the loopholes that people use and manipulate people for the powerful men that try to trap their women within prenups agreements, right? Most of the time, if people don't engage in prenups, the way in which they used to redress or address cheating and all these things during breakups is to use normal legal proceedings, which is much more expensive, much more time wasting, much more hectic and traumatizing, because there is no preset agreement as to exactly what should be done when these terrible things happen, which means on their side, even if you are going to argue, and I'm going to explain why these things become cheaper in the long term, on their side, the process of getting redress when people don't use prenups is much more expensive, which makes a lot of people walk away from getting that redress in the first place, or even when they engage in it, it's far more hectic and unlikely to get the kind of results that you want. First argument, the lack of access to prenups and why that is important, right? The reason why this is important is because most of the time, like we all have come to know, breakups are inevitable, which means creating an atmosphere that ensures that the separation is clean, swift, and fair is crucial, which means that most people can then be able to have these discussions prior to the time where things are terrible, where people will be operating in bad faith, and they themselves have an understanding of what they are willing to let go, and then have these discussions prior to the marriage. Secondly, the counterfactual of gaining redress on their side is much more expensive, much more terrible, much more brutal, which, given that you usually have to sue them, use normal legal processing. And so making prenups accessible hastens the process in a way that makes it much more clean. The reason why prenups are not accessible now is because there's stigmatization that goes on, which means even when people, especially minorities like women, within these relationships want to access it, there's a huge societal stigma that prevents them from doing that, because your man can manipulate you by saying, then it means you don't love me, then it means you really don't care, you just want to take my money away, etc. In a way that makes them very, very bad, feeling bad in opting into these things. Secondly, because it's not normalized, not a lot of people engage in this, which means there is lack of understanding about how this goes on, about exact processes to know about these things. What are the advantages? What are the downsides of it? And make a calculated decision about it. The lack of knowledge and the lack of participation in this also means that lawyers that do this probably charge expensive. So there is a high cost barrier that comes with engaging in or getting a law firm or a lawyer to do this. The ways in which we solve this is creating a systemic legal access, because this systemically creates a huge demand. For instance, the normalization process means it becomes a prerequisite to marriage, and so lots of people would have to do this. This signals for more professionals, more education into family law, into creating these things. Charities hop on to make it accessible to the most minorities in most instances. Subsidization. Business space is created where firms will start to compete to make the most cheap, the cheapest prenup services in a way in which makes it accessible. Secondly, the knowledge and understanding in this, which means that even for the minorities who are likely going to enter it either way, on gaps, on upside, for to be manipulated in these instances, have more understanding, likelihood of representation in these instances when they are breaking away within these prenups agreements. This means it becomes much more easier for people to access prenups, and that's fundamentally good because it makes breakup easy and people get a fair share of the kind of reparations and redress that they get. Theo.
I'm a bit confused. Typically in the status quo, prenups are used by rich people to make sure that they don't have to give up a large number of their assets to their much poorer partner. Why doesn't this exacerbate that problem?
No, it makes it actually worse, because on your side, the rich people get to cheat these poor partners and give them zero redress for those terrible things that they do to them and the manipulations that they get within that marriage. On our side, given that it is normalized, that poor person now understands exactly what a prenup means, understands and have access to services that can help them represent their interests during the prenup negotiations. I am unsure why you have to take the rich person's side when they themselves go through agreements in a way that's exploitative and allow them to cheat their way through marriages. Secondly, is improving prenup agreements, right? Because bad prenups are what exist in upside because it is used to trap people like COCs. And this is used as a weapon to disadvantage women and then trap them within marriages in a way that makes them not defend themselves. But the alternative to prenups, and for these minorities to get out and then sue when these men like decide to exploit them, etc., is far more expensive because they have to go through legal processing and all of that. What this does is that the normalization on our side creates a discourse that systemically educates most people, creates a systemic access to information, increased patronage, and easy access to family lawyers. More research is conducted into the areas of prenups and then sought to improve the systems and the way in which prenuptial agreements are made. What this means is that you improve prenups and help minorities get faster redress during breakups, because the mere fact that the rich guy is the one who is institutionalizing the prenup doesn't mean he's not the one who cheats his way during the relationship, and that creates a systemic asymmetry on CO side. You prevent trapping and toxic versions of prenups, and you do not lead long legal battles for minorities to be able to get away with it. The point is, prenups exist either way. How do you get the best versions of them? Gladly, OG.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the the leader of opposition. So, here.
Okay. I am going to start in. Oh, no, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Legal battles are going to take a long time anyway, because people don't just say, I have to give up half of my $1 billion or half of my $500,000 or half of any amount of money. I'm done. No, they take it to court anyway, they fight for it for years, they say no, they interpret the law and do all sorts of things that mean that it's very difficult, and still we're not going to just have people getting redress immediately. That's absurd. We see that in status quo where people fight about exactly these things. What do we think? What are the 3 things we're going to do in this debate? 1, we're going to show you why the locuses of power sit with normally men, but in general, whoever has the locus of power, whoever has the money, gets to dictate this contract, and this means that after the fact it's going to be worse than the status quo. And then we're going to also talk about why people enter marriages they shouldn't and don't take the commitment seriously enough when we have these things. Before that, just one more point of rebuttal. We hear that we're going to have charities who give people access. Like, when this is normalized, everyone is using this. That is literally billions of people on this planet who get married well, not every year, but hundreds of millions who get married every year. There is not enough charity in the world to make this accessible to high quality legal help. Like, I just don't accept that that's the case. Great. So let's understand and now the rest is going to be integrated. So firstly, on this idea of how we actually use this power, or how this power is actually used. So I think it's first of all important to understand that the people who these contracts often provide protections. This is the POI from closing, I guess, but let's just flesh this out a second, right? This means that when it discusses the criteria under which you get to leave the marriage, there can be differences in what those criteria are. So, for example, if you cheated, do you lose everything? Do you lose half? Do you lose 25%? Do you lose nothing? Who cheated might make a difference. There's recognition of different kinds of labor that may have happened. So, for example, under status quo, if you don't have this kind of document and you guys break up, then my wife could go and say, Yishai got to work in a high-tech job because I was staying at home taking care of the kids. I deserve half of whatever his labor bore fruit. Once we have these kinds of documents, we don't have to do that anymore. I can say the kind of labor that counts is only the money that exists at the end of the day, or the kind of labor that counts is only labor that is recognized by law, or all sorts of things like that. And then all that labor that my partner did wouldn't count for the purposes of when we're dividing the money at the end of the day. Why does this matter? Because this means that we have an asymmetrical division of the capital. Now, we also think that men are just much more likely to actually have more power when you get married. Why? Because oftentimes they're the ones who earn more money from the first job. They have access to better lawyers and they can pay more. Secondly, because the social narratives and the kinds of their framing mean that they are often more aggressive and they're more pushy. So men are going to be going, I want to have this, right? I want to have this, I want to have this. And the woman is much more likely to be more accepting or to feel like she has to accept because that's the social narrative we've been taught. Thirdly, because it just takes, men have a lot more to lose long term, right? If they're going to be earning more money and the woman isn't, then the woman's highest upside is still lower than the man's, and the man has more information about what his likely capabilities are, what his job is going to be, etc., etc. So the man can evaluate better how much this contract is likely to be worth to him in the future. Why is this? And of course, as I said, when we actually need to interpret this contract, the man probably has way more power, because as we get older, these differences get larger. As women have children, they are less and less and less. And the man, that means when we actually come to interpret this contract, we'll have much better lawyers and much better, and the judge who's going to be judging him is going to be a white male who's literally in exactly the same living situation, and so he's likely to engender a lot more sympathy than the women. So how do they actually use this power to basically fuck over the other side? It means that they just make sure the woman isn't going to get anything. They say, if you like the list of things under which the other side gets stuff doesn't include cheating, for example. So then the woman might cheat and then the man can break up and she gets nothing, or the man might cheat and the woman still gets nothing. Secondly, it means that you can deny certain counts of outs, and then people get trapped in the marriage. So maybe I don't have to pay support for the children, and that sounds fine. But then the woman won't be able to leave the marriage while the man might be able to, because he would be able to take care of the children by himself. It means that you learn how to actually get out of actually paying, right? You put in things that say, for example, you're not allowed to do an audit of the man's finances, which seems pretty fair overall. But that means that he can just transfer transfer the money to the Caymans, and then the woman doesn't get any of the money anyway. So it means that you actually teach them or insert into the contract ways for you to get around your obligation to pay. And finally, you just have asymmetrical contracts that make it a lot easier for one side to leave and basically trap the other side in terrible marriages, in scenarios where they have born 2 children and now they're stuck with a husband who shouts at them or who's being, he's not doing anything that's illegal, but he just treats them like shit and they can't leave because they don't have a pretext under which to leave and they get trapped in abusive marriage. Now, we also think that you just enter marriages that you should because you feel protected. You have this document that says, aha, prenup, great. And what this means is that you feel like you have an agreement that you can get out of. It feels like you've both written something about which you see eye to eye. And what this means is that oftentimes you don't notice, you get this kind of idea of, the behavior that this person is exhibiting, well, I'm protected, so I don't need to be as worried about them. So you don't take into account the fact that he might be kind of controlling. He might be treating you badly. He might be shouting at you. All these kinds of warning signs. If you say it's fine, I have this kind of protection, even though a lot of the times the actual protections that it provides are good. Or even if the protections are good and you could get out, by the time you actually get the money, or by the time you get any of these things, you've still suffered a lot of the harms of living in an abusive marriage, right? The fact you can get out doesn't mean that you're not suffering a lot of harm until you actually get out. And before I get on to why you don't take the commitment seriously, I'll take a POI from closing.
It's not entirely symmetric to divorce proceedings, seeing as like the laws surrounding divorce are equally bad for women.
Thank you. I don't think the laws surrounding divorce are equally bad for women, and no, I don't think it's. I think that if you're giving more power to one of the relative parties, which is what I've shown, then it will get even worse, right? Just because something might be bad doesn't mean it can't get worse. That's a common misconception. Okay. So, and then finally, we also think that you just don't take the commitment seriously, which is just a completely different point. So if you feel like you have this kind of exit point and you can just leave the marriage and you don't have to do anything about it, then this means that a lot of times the side feels like they're more able to get out. And we're talking about the side with more relative power, the side who can afford to pay to actually leave this marriage. And this means that you take the marriage a lot less seriously and you're more likely to both take the risk of marriage, but also just like not invest as much in the children because you don't care if the marriage falls apart. You're going to be able to pay this kind of stuff. You're going to be able to pay the thing. You don't support your partner like you should because you personally aren't going to. You didn't when you went in. You know that you have the ability to leave, and you don't take into account the fact you're actually going to need to take care of them under many different scenarios that might not actually be covered by the legal system. So because we think that you both enter marriages, you shouldn't behave badly in them, and because of the relative differences in power, please oppose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Can you see me too?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, Andy, I would appreciate that. Andy will be sending in timestamps. Sorry. All right, I'll take POIs within the chat, most likely in the 5th minute, and I'll have to take one from CEO, most likely the extension, so that I can engage it. Cool. Yeah, but if it's past five and I'm not taking you, you can just ping me anyway. 3, 2, 1. Panel. Recognize that the comparative, which OP is supposed to defend, is a world where this is not normalized. This means that prenups are going to exist anyway, especially for the people who have an incentive to use them. We say the way in which they use them is in a very bad way. All of the rich people that he's talking about who have the power to use this and abuse women are still going to use it anyway if this is not normalized. What we show you is that the normalization is able to create a level of disempowerment within the system by bringing in information, by reducing cost and allowing people to access it in ways in which it is very beneficial. The reason why this is important and why this wins us the round is because what this does is that even in the worst cases where you still have bad prenups. You have educated people who are rather making an educated guess before entering into these contracts in the very first place, which means that we prevent all of the harms which is talking about, which means that even if the power asymmetry even continues to exist after my 7 minutes, you are far more likely to have less women, you are far more likely to have less minorities enter and put themselves into very, very compromising positions, given that we are able to do all of the things that we see. But secondly, the alternative which exists on GAF side, on upside of the world, is to say the current legal systems. And I mean, that's what Theo is going to run and say that, well, if I go to court anyway, they're going to split it 50-50, and why that is maybe good. First off, we say that those legal systems in themselves are not accessible to a lot of people. But secondly, rich people are going to force them into contracts anyway, like I show in our world. We think that the ability to be able to influence those legal systems, to be able to create redistribution for those women is far less than on our side where we have prenups. But secondly, I'm unsure why that is even unfair in most instances or in most cases. Because when you have a prenups where both parties are informed, they can come to an agreement that fits both parties. And that is why in the end, you have those legal proceedings where the rich men continue to use their money and their power to bully those women and ensure that they do not get the 50 even in the first place. So I've shown you, even if you do have access, even if you do change the laws in most instances, these people who have an incentive to do so will still weaponize them against the women in most instances. Let's talk about first of all, the context or the narratives that exist around marriage, because narratives exist around marriage which have been normalized. For example, DNA tests, counseling, compatibility. At first, people were scared and just didn't want to go and check. Like churches encourage that people don't go and check their DNA or their compatibility in most instances. Not only that, people said, well, it means you do not love me and you want to upset all of these things. But recognize that most of these things have changed. All of these methods which have a tone of distrust have changed and have been institutionalized as a part of marriage, which means that now more and more, there's more conversations around marriage. There's more discussion around these things and a level of normalization. For example, these things are taught now in churches. There are public debates within the media, and the government's continuing to spread most of these things, which means that previously, where the conversation about prenups was very hard, given that the stereotypes against men, that people were not even willing to bring it up in the first place, now people are forced to have the discussion. They are forced to do it with the level of oversight which would happen in our world. Secondly, how are prenups used now? And that is what they need to defend, because without the normalization, they still have it in isolated forms. First, the stereotypes which surround it, that doing it means that you do not love your partner. You're not deciding to sign it means that you do not, you want to get your husband's money, amongst a number of things. We think we're able to break these stereotypes. What it then means that we're able to create more context and scenarios which shows how these things can be applied in most circumstances, and we're able to have conversations around them. Is it good to sign them? In what cases is it not good to sign them? Secondly, the level of power asymmetry continues to exist. But then how do these things improve in our world? Before I go on, Theo.
In the status quo, divorce is normalized, and yet the vast majority of people are not experts in divorce law. Why does more information necessarily translate into greater knowledge about the legal process?
You are certain that divorce is normalized before you get all of those other things. I don't think divorce is normalized. I think when we see divorce actually normalized, you're going to have a lot of people go into divorce law. And even if that is the trend, as you've seen, especially within developed countries where there's more information, we are seeing the rise of more divorce lawyers, family courts, which are dealing with these situations. We are beginning to see that children who, for example, when we look within the USA, Black children who were the cost of divorces, who were later on becoming criminals and end up being incarcerated, we saw a lot of influx of family lawyers within Black communities. I come from a Black community, and that's become a discussion. You usually even have these things attached to you. The level of change happens on our side of the house. I don't think it's something that you can deny. How prenups improve on our side? The normalization is able to bring a couple of things. First of all, information, which means that there's less ambiguity around the contract you are signing, which means that you are far more empowered, which means that we give minority groups and we give the vulnerable people within those contracts far more power and far more leverage when entering into those contracts. Secondly, the legal access, which he told you that there's more research in here, which means that there's far more investments, which means that people go to school, want to learn about these things and want to provide those services. Because currently, when you go and become a divorce lawyer or whatever it is, you do not get any work. But now there's far more work for you, so people want to enter into it. Thirdly, research, which means that we have social experiments, which we are using to improve the situation, which means we have data on what is working, what is not working. So maybe we do not guarantee that every everything will change. Like Matt is saying, we'll have divorce lawyers all of a sudden, but over time, this is far more likely to change given what we have. Lastly, in terms of cost, because there's far more access to it, this technology is far more accessible to a lot of people, and we're able to reduce the massive costs which come with these things. Lastly, I just want to clarify this: the power of contracts, because I think it would really be stupid to say you get like the worst contracts, right? Because on our side, less people get into that in the first place. But secondly, contracts also depend on the level of adaptability, and that level of adaptability comes with you having information specifically about this, which means that we're able to create more context and scenarios. If I get a job, what is the implication on me? If I lose the job, what's the implication on me? On their side, you are far more likely to get bad contracts, right? On our side, you are far more likely to get good ones because individuals are far more informed about this, right? Are far more informed about this. Let me deal with some extraneous things which comes from OO. First, they say not many people will be able to afford it. First of all, the charities and other we mentioned lots of mechanisms. They just said charities, but even in these instances, we give it to the most vulnerable, as most people will be able to access it. We still show you how it gets cheap with all of the other things which we spoke about, and they still do not defend why the asymmetric division which exists on their side is something which is very, very useful. So on our side, we're able to give the people choice when entering into these legal agreements, even to the point where they can decide that they do not want to enter into them. We do think that they now have the specific agency to be able to create those kind of changes. We've already won this round. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the debate for the top half. Theo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Excellent. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We are going to win this debate on 2 different metrics. The first is we're going to show, we have shown, and I will explain to you how, that we have shown that the divorce process is better on our side without prenups, that people are more equitably receive their, divide up their wealth, and also that the process itself is better and simpler. We're then also going to show that we show that marriages themselves get better on our side, because it is more likely that people enter into marriages that have a chance, and also that they behave within those marriages in a reasonable manner. Before I explain how we win both of those things, I'd like to rebut some of the things that we just heard from OG. Now, the first thing is OG claimed that prenups between people with an imbalance of power are symmetrical in the debate, and that is basically their major response to us. First off, there's clearly going to be far less of prenups within these instances, right? OG themselves say that in status quo, there's stigma about getting a prenup, and people are reticent to do it, and they think that it is a sign of you being stingy or of you not believing in your marriage, or all sorts of things like that. And therefore, there's a lot less willingness for people to participate in it. What this means is that even if one side wants a prenup, it's a lot easier in our world for the other side to simply refuse and say, no, I don't want to marry you with a prenup, to shame them by telling their friends and their family, hey, I don't think that it's appropriate that this person wants a prenup from me. I think it says bad things, and have those people also tell that person, yeah, you shouldn't be getting a prenup. Why are you insisting on a prenup? You have all of this social pressure that you can create on our side, but prenups are not normalized. This means way more individuals get forced into prenups on Gov's side of the debate, and they cannot try and run away from this burden. The second thing is about what OG tried to claim is, oh, well, the super wealthy are getting prenups anyway because they want to defend their extreme wealth, and so this is remaining the same. Even though I think we also dealt with that and that doesn't remain the same, note that that's not the only situation in which there are enormous power imbalances between individuals. You don't have to be the top echelon in order to just have a lot more resources and a lot more wealth than the person you are marrying. Our entire economic system is on a huge scale, and you could pick any 2 points on the scale that would have a big gap between them. The point is that at the moment that you have that gap, that is when you open up for people to be taken advantage of and to create situations where they have a lot more power. Next, the thing about this saying, oh, when we normalize and we're giving people access, there's going to be resources, there's going to be these stock contracts and stuff like that. First off, note that things such as like dealing with divorce in a stock manner where every single marriage has the exact same conditions and the divorces look the same, that exists. That looks like legislation. That looks like precedent set in the courts. We don't think that we need prenups in order to create this problem, this solution, because we think it is a solution that we legally required. You cannot rent a property without one. And yet, the person letting the property, who generally is more wealthy and has a better ability to control the conditions of the lease and the terms of it, has way more power than the person letting the property from them, despite the fact that everybody is constantly letting properties. Because the fact that you know you're going to have to sign a lease someday does not mean that you can afford a lawyer to look over your specific lease and check the terms, does not mean that you get to dictate all of the terms of your lease and that you have the bargaining power necessary to do so, and does not mean that your power is equal to that of the other party. Having any minimal power does not mean you equalize your power to the other party within the negotiation. And so we don't think that that solves the problem to any extent whatsoever. Now, let's talk about divorces and on which side they're better. Note that the comparative to prenups and people vastly getting prenups is simply defaulting to legislation and precedents set within the courts, which is what happens in status quo when a couple gets divorced without a prenup. Note that this sort of legislation and these sorts of precedents are set by legislatures in a way that is supposed to be as equitable as possible and dividing resources in a way that society in general agrees is a correct way. Why? Because they have political pressures on them to do this in an equal way. They have pressures, they have mixed incentives of different groups that all want to make sure that regardless of what situation they find themselves in marriage someday in a theoretical situation, they want to be protected to a reasonable extent. Basically, this legislation is happening to an extent behind the veil of ignorance. None of this is true of a prenup, which is for a specific instance where one side gets to dictate the terms more than the other. So we definitely think that defaulting to the status quo norm is much, much better. Why do we think things are more equitable on our side? And note the POI that we get that claims that, oh, but at the moment there's already a power imbalance when you reach the divorce court. But there's a very big difference because we've given now a huge additional tool to the individual with more resources. Not only do you have more lawyers at the divorce court looking for loopholes and trying to get you out of this, you've got to have them put the loopholes in there to begin with so that they would be able to get you out of it when the time came. You managed to set up the entire game in a way that you always did. That is the enormous problem that we're creating here. There does not exist in status quo, regardless of the imbalance. But also note on the length of proceedings or the complexity of divorce and how that happens, that there is no clear benefit on government side because there is still an enormous incentive from both parties to dispute the prenup, to argue about the interpretation of the different clauses, to argue about the evidence of certain acts having occurred, like someone having cheated, to argue about what exactly the different assets are and what counts as equitable division of these. All these proceedings still occur, but in fact, they get far, far worse. But before I explain why, closing? Opening?
Yeah, we're not claiming to end all sexism. We just think that it's good to give people material choices at the outset of what is primarily a contractual relationship and that this is going to lead to better outcomes for them and their children.
Okay, I'll deal with that in a moment. Why do we think that the proceedings get so much worse? Because we think that at the point where not every divorce that comes before the courts is the same and is under the same conditions and terms and legislation and precedents, that is when the court process takes way longer because the lawyers have to explain to the judge, wait, these were the conditions of the prenup, these are the different clauses. They argue before the judge has to learn all of these factors. This makes the whole thing way more complex and way longer. But why also do we think when people are entering to begin with into the marriages are things so much worse? Because you're far more likely to enter into a marriage that you're not fully committed to because you feel like when you leave this marriage, you can leave it exactly as you entered it. We want people when they enter marriage to be aware of the fact that this is a life-changing thing, that they have to be aware of, that they want to expect it not to end in divorce. I think when people end in divorce, and that is precisely when their marriages are far more likely to be ill-suited to begin with. They're going to bring children into an unhappy home where they're not going to be receiving the support and love that they deserve. They're more likely to divorce and incur all of the harms that occur on love that we just don't incur if they don't get bad marriages and they don't divorce to begin with. Please oppose.
Thank you much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the member of government to open the closing half. Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, getting started now. So panel, in closing government today, we're not going to reach for this extreme impact that opening government has opted for, which is to end inequality and end in contractual inequality for minorities and for women and for people who are generally disadvantaged by the legal system. But we are going to advocate for giving people material changes, giving people the ability to contract out of situations which are going to damage them in the long run. And I think this is going to have a net benefit for just the average person in an average marriage in the world today. We think that this is more beneficial. We think that under status quo, divorce proceedings are normalized and they're horrendous for parties, they're horrendous for the children that are involved, and they don't actually serve anyone. So it's much far better to normalize prenups. So first of all, just a little note on opening opposition's case and rebuttal against them will be weaved into the speech, but we think that the thrust of their case is essentially that the prenups will ultimately be unequal contractual relationships because of the imbalance in power between men and women and between other groups when they marry. We think that like ultimately their case is symmetric because you still have this occurring on our side of the house. We think that ultimately like the inequalities on our side of the house are far worse, as we're going to explain, because divorce proceedings are based on judicial discretion, and those judges can give judgments which favor the party which has more money anyway. And we think that that's probably far worse in the circumstances, because then a woman has to be dragged through divorce proceedings and stripped of all her assets because she's paying her legal fees. We think that that's far worse. But also we think that, like, yes, contractual inequality will exist, but there's a lot of safeguards against it when you're making a contract. Like we think, as we'll explain, like we think you have an attorney reviewing your contract, you have other people who you've spoken to who have made these contracts before. There are more safeguards there which can actually prevent that relationship from being so detrimental in the first place. So we think that our side ultimately wins on that. So I'm just going to introduce a bit of framing now. So what actually happens under status quo today? Like why is divorce proceedings so bad? We think that like this debate doesn't really happen in a context of extreme financial abuse or massively unequal relationships where like the woman has nothing and the man has absolutely everything. We think that this probably is happening in the context of normal relationships where people really love each other and they want to give this marriage thing a go. We think that people are really optimistic in their relationships, and like they especially are quite awkward, and they don't want to talk about things that might ruin the romance or might ruin those first amazing months, that honeymoon era or whatever. They don't want to talk about money, they don't want to talk about finances because it's embarrassing and it's prickly, and you're worried that it might change how your partner sees you. You're worried about how it might make their family feel about you. We think that like this not isn't necessarily like predicated on the stigma the proposition talks about. Like we're not sure that this stigma exists, but we do think that like it is unromantic to talk about financial assets when you're starting on what is primarily a romantic relationship. So this actually prevents people from thinking critically and thinking logically about their assets and also their future, because we think what's happening currently is that people are living much longer. Life expectancy is increasing like across the world, which means that people like tend to want new relationships when they come to retirement, like when they come to the age of around 60 or something, when kids are all grown up. They often want like a new lease of life. They want a new partner. I mean, like marriages before, like the whole contract of marriage is based on the idea that people will only live like 40 years. So of course you're going to like stay with the same person for the whole time. But now people are living far longer. So we think it's normalized that people depart from each other and have, friendly endings to proceedings. But why can't people do that under status quo? We think that people on both sides, like both men and women, are incredibly afraid to do this because they're worried that they'll lose the house. They're essentially worried because there's uncertainty surrounding divorce proceedings. Like you don't know how the judgment will go. You don't know, will it take away all your assets, or will you be left with nothing? You just don't know how it's going to play out. And it depends a lot on the judge that you have on the day, and it depends on the amount that you're willing to pay for legal fees. So this actually just prevents people from initiating divorce proceedings, and it prevents them from making that meaningful choice. So we think that it's this uncertainty that really that really is the crux of the debate. So what changes on our side of the house? We think that when prenups are normalized, this is a really good thing. Firstly, we think that just contracts are good from the outset. We think that contracts necessarily involve that the parties come together and have a frank and full conversation about what it is that they want to do with their assets. We think that this happens in a context of like how the relationship is. Like if somebody's more dominant anyway, then maybe their voice will be heard more. But we still think that it's better that they do sit down and have a talk about that. And we think that crucially on our side of the house, those kinds of arrangements are made in good faith. Like you love your partner, you don't want to shaft them just when you're coming together for the first time. You want you want the relationship to work. So you're making a prenup with the outlook that the relationship is going to work out and that you will treat your partner with love and respect if you do end up splitting. So we think that this is the really crucial difference on our side of the house that is extremely different from opposition's case, which is that people end up, resolving things in divorce proceedings with a lot of bad faith and a lot of bad blood. Yeah, I'll take your POI.
Yeah, honeymoon romance means that men who are more socially encouraged to be aggressive, dominant, and think about money are much more likely to make demands and refuse the other side, saying you're exhibiting a lack of trust.
I don't think that's not true. Sorry, I think that's not true. Like, I think that like women have plenty behind them which like enable them to get contractual power in the situation. Like, I think a lot of the times, like really beautiful women will say like, no, I won't marry you unless you give me like, you know, half of your assets upon divorce. Like there's power imbalances that go both ways and actually enable you to get power in that situation. Like that's a lot of the reason prenups are made in the first place. So we think that they're going to be made in good faith, and this is a good thing. But crucially, they're also going to be overseen by attorneys who can give you advice and actually input and say like, oh, I don't think that clause would be fair. I don't think that would work out for you well. So you actually already have this de facto discussion. Which means that the outcome of the prenup that you're aiming for is likely to be good. Why then is divorce like far, far worse? The kind of legislation and precedent that they're talking about basically never goes women's way. This is because, like, first of all, judges have a lot of discretion, and they tend to be like older men who are like, you know, from like a more conservative era, and they tend to favor the party that is more powerful under the patriarchy. They probably favor men if they're given discretion in the case. Secondly, we think that the only kinds of cases that reach precedent level, like they become great law that's abided by, are people that have huge amounts of money. It's normally like celebrity cases. They're the only people that can take divorce proceedings to that level of court. And those kinds of cases aren't really indicative of normal people's marriages anyway. And you probably get weird precedent coming out of them that don't apply to, you know, your average Joe down the street. And also, we think that legislation will just like disfavor women. Like we say that under status quo, divorce law doesn't recognize that women's contribution in the home matters and that it should be divided 50-50 in light of that. Like legislation currently does not recognize that, so it's not going to be fair. So we think on our side of the house, prenups are much better because they take less time. They can be enforced using minimal legal tools. You can have an attorney do it in like 5 minutes. And it means you can have an amicable split where people aren't going to hate each other and divorce proceedings don't last forever. So for that reason, we beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the member of opposition here.
Cool. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with government teams in this debate is that they're contingent on the wide use of prenups being good, but they miss a critical mechanism to prove their case, which is an explanation as to why the normalization of prenups generate the positive and equitable social discourse they need for their case to work. If we can prove at Theo that the process of normalization will be bad rather than good, it flips the debate because the positive discussions and better outcomes they want as a result won't happen. This will also fill a gap in opening opposition, because opening opposition does a good job of explaining why prenups are coercive and likely bad, but this is non-responsive to the best case OG, which is that societal discourse around prenups will change and somehow make prenups far more equitable. First extension. Why does the process of normalization look really, really terrible, especially for people on the wrong side of a power differential? First, I think the way this normalization likely takes place, which is the key word in the motion that other teams have missed, is likely to look like influencers, i.e. people with money and success online, telling you that you need a prenup and it is normal, and continuing to do this at a scalar level until it becomes more normalized within society. It's also likely to look like rich people who have way more traction, advertising power, and degrees of media control, dictating the narrative around prenups. Note that these rich people have an incentive to not get fucked over by prenups being incredibly equitable or incredibly slanted in favor of the partner with less resources, so it's likely to be the case that they normalize it in such a manner that isn't particularly attentive to specific legalese and specific ways in which you can make the prenup more equitable. It's probably not the feminist movement as an intuition, because the feminist movement has limited resources, and they're far more likely to, you know, split their resources between advocating for abortion rights, advocating for divorce rights, and things like this. And by comparative, it's far more likely to be dictated with the people with the most amount to lose, and that is the people with large amounts of money. But finally, whatever it looks like, it's not likely to look like a deeper understanding of legalese and deeper understanding of these contracts. As an intuition, divorce is widely normalized within the Western world. However, people still get divorced fairly regularly, even in scenarios where it wouldn't be suitable to them, and they don't understand the nuances and intricacies of divorce law. The structural reason for this is because people have a limited amount of time and resources, especially if they're poor and they work a 9 to 5 and they have a large number of dependents they have to take care of, but people have a limited amount of time to sift through information. So as information becomes more common inside government, it becomes far harder for you to access what is a good-bad prenup at the point at which there's large amounts of contrasting perspectives, even in their absolute best case. So what does this volume of information do and why is it harmful? The first thing I think it does is that it's likely to be far more discussion in wealthy and elite circles about how best to protect your assets from people trying to take them. That is to say, when there is more volume of information and discourse from rich white men about how to protect their assets, there's likely to be far more strategies and ways they come up with to minimize having to give out tons of money in the divorce process, i.e. how to add tons of legal text to confuse your potential partner and confusing clauses to get them to sign that lawyers who are less well versed in this law are unlikely to notice. But secondly, any high profile story about a rich man losing lots of money because he was inattentive in a prenup is likely to get far more attention in a world where prenups are normalized. What this does is it creates a preemptive incentive for wealthy people who are more likely by their own admission on government to be in prenups on their side to protect their wealth. This means that the people with access to better lawyers do a lot more to ensure they don't lose their assets at the outset preemptively before they enter into that agreement. But thirdly, when prenups are more normalized, people seeking marriage are likely to scrutinize them less and enter them more on bad terms, even when they otherwise wouldn't have entered in a prenup at all on up. The reason this is true is because when something is seen as normal in society, it's far more easy to sell this to your partner as something everyone is doing and something that's obligatory, which means that now when your partner proposes you sign a prenup, you don't question it as frequently or scrutinize the text as much because it's seen as far more standard. The comparative is when it is rarer, the weaker party has far more leverage because they can ask why the stronger partner wants them to enter into this relationship and into this prenup in the first place. When there's less of a precedent involved and it's less normalized, you're far more likely to question it within yourself and far more likely to pay more attention to those kinds of things. But finally, you just get way worse information because when the status quo, when prenups are unusual as opposed to normal, you're far more likely to A, question why your partner wants to opt into it, but B, be able to get information about the narrow areas in time where prenups are actually used. The comparative is when there's a larger volume of information about different places, you're likely to see tons of different stories, which is confusing, and you're more likely to believe that what is happening to you is normal. Weighing this argument to opening opposition, O has two things. The first is that the divorce proceedings get more acrimonious, which is rather uncomparative given they themselves admit that divorce proceedings are still going to happen and still be bad. Incidentally, this is also why CG is symmetric because even if you have a prenup, you're still going to fight in a divorce court and still be acrimonious if your marriage is acrimonious, so it's unclear why the resolution is a positive one. But secondly, they say that more people get into marriages earlier. The problem is this is symmetric. On either side, people will get married in Russian either because they're young and horny and stupid, because of religious pressure, because of parental and family pressure. I'm unclear why a prenup or lack thereof is a tipping point. What we prove is the discussions themselves are bad, which is a necessary mechanism in order for them to claim their benefits in the first place. Weighing to OG. At best, OG proves that some people with power asymmetry in relationships have some degree of information. The problem is if it's the case that rich men will be coercive on either side as they concede, I'm not clear why having more normalization leads to better info rather than worse info. This was the flip. Second extension. Why do marriages get worse? Importantly, this argument will be contingent only on more prenups happening. So even if you buy none of the first claim, this still stands in the debate. And recognize this is the largest impact in the round, because on either side, I don't think the impact on coercive situations is the biggest, because Andy and Erasmus themselves can see that people in coercive situations will likely be coerced on either side, as does Yishai. So the resentment at the opt-in point to marriage is the first mechanism here. Why does resentment at the opt-in point to marriage across marriages become more likely when prenups are more commonplace? Because now when prenups are normalized, you preemptively consider all of the different outcomes that could end the marriage from the outset. This creates far more conflict at the start of the marriage between many people who don't need it, because the comparative is those people wouldn't be thinking about a prenup, but now they have to think about this all at the outset. This means you get way more resentment from the very beginning, which creates preemptive unrest within the relationship that otherwise wouldn't exist. Before I finish explaining this argument, I'll take POI from opening.
I am unclear how the rich will continue to dominate the discussion when the outcomes are bad, like you said, when there will be call-outs, discussions, and other social groups. Also, we show you how the state will be involved, which has a mutual interest. There's more education. I'm not sure why I do that.
The problem is call-outs are significantly more likely to gain traction when prenups are rarer and the media ecosystem is less flooded with information. The second reason call-outs are more likely to happen on our side is when the process is normalized, it's less likely to fall on deaf ears. Many people are not feminists and not woke. So when on your side, when somebody leaves a prenup and they really screw over a partner, it's likely to be seen as really, really bad. On our side, it's likely to be seen as really aberrant. That's the difference, right? The second claim here is that problem solving within the marriage becomes far worse. Why? You're less likely to engage in problem solving because when you base the outcome for ending the relationship on legal conditions preemptively, even in the best case, there's a higher likelihood you in the relationship don't build the skills necessary to foster a proper relationship. As an illustration, this looks at you as a partner in a relationship being less willing to compromise on things because you know you have this stopgap valve at the end of the day to opt out if it goes wrong. But thirdly, it makes it harder for you to be responsive to changes in the relationship because while you can negotiate a prenup, you need renegotiate a prenup, you need both partners to agree, which means it's harder to plan rather than easier. As an illustration, this looks like if one partner suddenly becomes far more wealthy than the other, but the prenup on the outset had an unfavorable condition for that person, you make it far harder to renegotiate those things. The weighing on this is that independent of whether discourse around prenups is good or bad, this argument is true, but also it affects a far larger number of people, the people who wouldn't have prenups on Gov, but do now as a result. So I've won on the metric of government teams, and I've won on my own metric that is orthogonal to the debate and affects a far larger number of people. Incredibly proud to stand in closing opposition.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And I'd like to call upon the government whip to close the debate for government side. Here.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Oh, perfect. Okay. My Wi-Fi is not great, so let me know in the chat if I go in and out, and I'll like stop for a second. Otherwise, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I think we got one response from closing opposition who say that our case is symmetric insofar as divorce happens on both sides. I think that what they ignore is what Amy tells you, which is most people, if they don't have a prenuptial agreement, they don't even initiate divorce proceedings. It's extremely difficult for the vast majority of people to even conceive of having a divorce if they've got no idea how that's going to play out in court. Like OG or OO and CO try and give us this idea that like everything is very clear, the outcomes are very clear when you have a divorce because there's things like legislation, but legislation only governs things like the form of the divorce. It can never you can never get legislation that's so specific that you know what's definitely going to happen. And if you have like an extremely coercive partner, like you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, especially if you are like if you're not the main breadwinner in the family and you have no idea how things are going to play out. And it's then therefore much more like you have a much greater degree of protection at the point at which you have a prenuptial agreement, because even if you end up fighting it, you have a clear idea of what the starting point is. So you know that like even if you're extremely rich and coercive partner is going to fight you on every single term of the contract of the prenup that you made, it's still better than initiating a divorce based on nothing because you've got some idea of how things are going to play out. Like a judge which as Amy tells you would otherwise not have believed you or not have taken any of your considerations into account if you were not there standing in front of them with a prenuptial agreement, now has to take what you say into account because there's a prenuptial agreement on his desk in front of him and he's listening to you explain why it's so important to you, how you formed it not under duress, and how you want to stick by it. That means that at least you have some kind of confidence in the fact that divorce proceedings will go more in your favor, and if you're in a bad relationship, you're more likely to initiate it. But what's also likely to happen is your divorce proceedings are shorter and like they're less acrimonious. They don't involve your children as negatively when your marriage ends. All those are things that OG or that OO and CO claim to care about, but all of them fall under our side of the house. Okay, what do opening opposition tell us? They tell us that CO will rely on this contention like to a significant extent as well, that the form of contracts is about stipulating like what happens when a certain form of cheating happens or different conditions to end the marriage. That is not what a prenup is. A prenup it's only triggered by the end of a relationship, not like, and it doesn't like set out conditions for the ending of that relationship. So like there aren't stipulations in a prenuptial agreement about what can trigger the end of a relationship. So it isn't coercive in the way that both teams claim it is, and it says that in Infoslide. It's a financial thing about the division of assets, so it doesn't force behavior in the moment in a relationship. Then COO or OO tell us that this is only this, and this is like these things are really bad because they just reinforce the power that men already have in a relationship. But like that power, like it's societal power. It didn't just come out like. Patriarchy didn't just get invented with the development of prenuptial agreement law. Like, men's power applies to marriage and it applies to divorce proceedings, and it's much worse in those contexts because it's acrimonious and it's long-term and the financial ramifications are larger. What that means then is that prenuptial agreements they are subject to conditions of patriarchy or whatever, because we live in a patriarchy. We live in a society where like power relations are unequal. But what prenuptial agreements do is they allow you to put a legal spin on your marriage when you are still in an amicable mood. So like when you still like your partner, when you can still imagine breaking up with them amicably because you care about them on an emotional level and you don't want to screw them out of everything that they own. And that's when it's most favorable to women, because it's most favorable to get people in a good mood when they can imagine giving you some of their assets at the end. That's why it's much better than divorce. Even though OOs try to claim that both are a legal process, it's much easier and it's much less traumatic, and you're much more confident in yourself when you're able to set out the conditions of life after marriage, when you still like your partner and you're able to have a reasonable conversation about it. Then CO try and tell us then that this is not good because it instigates like further resentment in your marriage and reduces problem solving. I mean, I think that like to some extent, like you're always going to have acrimony within a marriage, but also I just think that it's better to find out that your partner is a complete shithead who doesn't want you to have like any money. If you can't make it work with them, it's probably better to find that out at the beginning of marriage than somewhere along the way. Because if your marriage is successful, you will find that out at some point, whether it be like at the point at which they won't give you your own, they won't let you have any access to their bank account, or they won't let you spend any of their money. If you marry the wrong person, you'll find out about it at some point, and it's better to find out about that before rather than during, before you've like signed up to signed them into your will. It's also just much better. It also just doesn't, I don't think it does reduce problem solving. I think it enhances problem solving at the point at which you're able to have conversations about difficult things, or at the very least, you've established you can't do that. That's something that you're going to need to work on, or else ignore for the rest of your relationship. Okay, then there's this idea. Then I think Theo come at us and say, no, none of us have explained how normalization happens, and therefore it'll happen just because of what they claim, which is influencers and rich people disseminating very specific narratives about prenuptial agreements. I think to some extent we can probably say that when prenuptial agreements are normalized, they're normalized, and that means that people know about them and think that they're normal. I think that like we don't necessarily have to, like, I think that, like, it's not true that the only way people get narratives is through influencers and rich people. I think also, by the way, most popular influencers are women and are not likely to go around talking about specific contract provisions that don't fit into the majority of influencing content currently. But also, I think that like probably what happens is when things are normalized, also your neighbors have them, or your grandmother had one and she really liked it when she got rid of your grandfather aged 75, and probably you just know about them. So like even if feminists don't talk about how you can like milk your just possible, you probably still do have loads of information about how they come about, and you probably do know a lot about contract forms. And like it's obviously true that people don't understand divorce law, but people do understand the ramifications of divorce. I think people probably will better understand the ramifications of a bad prenup after like several years, because people's experiences come out about it. Like the way that people understand how acrimonious divorce can be, that's just something people understand. People will begin to understand how difficult it can be when you structure your prenup incorrectly. What that means then is, even if at the beginning people are to some extent exploited and coerced into staying in their marriage, over time this improves to a significant extent. And like it is true that like obviously extremely rich people do engage in preemptive protection of their wealth, but like it's also good to at least discuss that at the beginning of their marriage. Like I think it just is very unlikely when you're at the beginning of your marriage, even if you can't imagine it possibly breaking up, it's very unlikely that you just sit down and sign whatever is put in front of you because you like the person, because obviously that's symmetric. The person likes you too, and they want you to make an informed decision about what you're doing, even if they're trying to protect their wealth as well. And even if that's true and the person is doing aggressive preemptive protection of their wealth, I don't understand why that isn't symmetric, and I don't understand why that is any worse. Than if you didn't have a prenuptial agreement, because presumably they would still be protected in divorce proceedings. The only difference is that at least you're talking about it at the beginning of your marriage and not when everything falls apart at the end. Thank you, and I beg you to close.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. I'd like to remind all speakers to take an off for POIs. Without further ado, I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close the debate as a whole. Here.
Hey everyone, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Am I visible?
Yes, you are.
Great. For POIs, put them in the chat. I'll let you know when I'm ready to take you. I'll probably take one from OG. Yeah, I'll take one from OG. Making sure I get my timer sorted. The world's manual says I have up to a minute, so I'm gonna milk this time. Great, just making sure I got my notes. Sensational. 3, 2, 1. Imagine if before you entered a competition with your debate partner, perhaps Worlds, there was a prenuptial agreement that said your friendship afterwards will depend on how much points you had, the speaks you guys got as a team. It would probably make the relationship quite shitty and probably not something that you should enter to. I know if I entered one with Matt, our friendship would not end up very well afterwards. I'm going to go team by team and explain to you why the analysis Matt gave you very clearly takes them out. It's very nice when he wins the debate from MO. Firstly, on CG. The first thing I want to dismantle is the aspect of how it normalizes important conversations, right? The things about like how finances can be otherwise unromantic and the subsequent impacts off of that, right? The ways in which it makes the relationship a lot smoother because you talk about these things afterwards, makes divorce proceedings easier, etc. So this is the logical kind of premise behind the case. I think full and frank conversations are largely going to be symmetric and happen regardless on either side. Why? One, nobody enters into marriages lightly because they know it's long term and they know that a child could erupt from it. Secondarily, the fear of divorce that they and OG analyze is why most people have full and frank conversations. The fear that a relationship could otherwise end up so horrible is in the back of people's subconscious based on Gov's own analysis. Thirdly, people have heard enough horror stories that make them worried. And fourthly, if you buy none of that, families often prompt these discussions as well. So they compel people to make sure that they go into and have those unromantic conversations before they get into the romance, so they know that their kid isn't going with someone who isn't going to be able to either provide for them or abuse them throughout their entire life. But I'm going to flip this. I think the conversation gets substantially better. Why? Because on Gov, you presume you've had all the important conversations and predicted everything that could happen, which inflates the expectation that can never be met because marriages themselves are very unpredictable. So what is the upshot of all of this and aftermath analysis? You still have all the important conversations necessary to avoid all of the harm that Gov talks about, but the difference is that you don't craft an artificial image of the marriage that inevitably doesn't match up in your head and makes the relationship itself substantially worse when it otherwise didn't need to. That is to say, you don't need to artificially create points of conflict that don't exist, but you still have the necessary conversations because that happens regardless in any marriage. Now I want to deal with their second prong that also kind of engages with O, that it makes divorce proceedings easier because there's more information prior. One, note this doesn't engage with Matt's analysis for why the prenups will take a very pernicious form and empower those who influence the nature of prenups. And it's not just the rich people and the attempt at rebutting Matt by pointing out one example that he gave of an influencer, but it's also the very nature of information overload, which is the more information that there is available, the more it crowds out or dilutes the possible potential conversations about the abuses. That is to say, I think when it is substantially more unorthodox, it raises to the top. That's when you have op-eds written about it. That's when it enters the subconscious mind or the conscious mind of people, and they are more aware of it because it's not something that is otherwise normal and swept under the rug. But secondarily, less information tends to benefit the weaker parties more because it's less information that can be used against them in the court that Gov themselves say are pointed against them. But I think divorce courts themselves actually benefit women. Why? One, there's a presumption that women will be better at taking care of the kids often using another narrative that exists in society that women can weaponize. Secondarily, often there's a presumption that women are more vulnerable, which is why payments from men for child support are quite large and tend to be given from the man to the woman as opposed to the inverse. And thirdly, while yes, the patriarchy exists on either side, precedents in divorce law historically have tended to favor women, which is why prenups were invented in the first place to fight back against that narrative that empowered women within those proceedings. So the upshot of all of this is that CG don't actually engage with the logical links that Matt gave you, but even if they did, I've rebutted it and explained why in actuality, it actually tends to favor women substantially more, analysis that O didn't give you. On OG then, their kind of very clever case, I think, is that prenups exist on both sides, but normalization improves that process substantially more. The primary mechanism is that this essentially reduces stigmatization behind it. The fact that it's not that you don't love your partner, you feel more comfortable engaging in these conversations in church, etc., which provides more information that leads to the swath of benefits that they provide. Note Matt's analysis for why likely the destigmatization process doesn't take the process that OG talks about, because it engages directly with their own framing, which is if the power asymmetries in society exist the way they talk about, then those power asymmetries dictate what it's like to be normal and what defines normal within these prenuptial agreements, which will benefit those who have more power. But I'm going to be very direct to make that disengagement clear, and like the inverse of why OG says, the unorthodoxness of it raises the attention of it to make sure that the abuses that they talk about are more salient and highlighted. So the abuses gain more traction, but it's things like op-eds written, and it captures the imagination of people that's more likely to actually garner the attention that they otherwise want. So Matt didn't just explain why the rich can control it, even though they can, but even if you don't buy that and O's analysis on it, the volume of info itself does the inverse of what OG wants. Before engaging directly with the impacts that they now provide from that then weighing to, oh, I will take OG if they have a POI quickly.
Yeah, you only give competing mechs on normalization and don't show how ours is not the most plausible, because your case presupposes that info on our side will be bad without explaining why influencer and all actors involved will put up bad info. You assume prenup lead to bad relationships while we show it improves on our side.
No. So that's 15. So I'm going to be very, very explicit now. The reason why Matt isn't just competing but superior analysis is because, one, he talks about the origination point. Who has the power to create those narratives in the first place? Secondarily, the historical trajectory, or if you don't buy that he gave, that I gave, that is to say prenups existed as a way to counteract the power that women have. But thirdly, even if you don't buy any of that, why, just intuitively speaking, when something does not have a lot of information prior to behind it, it captures the attention of people prior. So that is to say, it's not the singular mechanisms that Matt gives, but the plethora of them that overcompensate against OG's analysis. Now let's go into direct analysis against their impacts. The first thing they say is that there's more information about the marriage before you enter. Note I already talked about why the benefit is likely to have a marginal delta, because those important discussions happen regardless. But secondarily, on legal access, I already explained to you why in the weighing to CG, why the legal access from divorce courts are historically have been better, and incentive-wise and utilizing narratives that exist in society tend to benefit women more. The simple reason we outweigh OO is because their case is pronged on the asymmetry of power and how it's used. But as Gov pointed out, it's largely very uncomparative. If power asymmetry exists, why are women not also pushed into marriages they don't like without the potential benefits of a prenup? They entirely assert that it will favor those with more power just because they have more power. What Matt tells you is the logical link needed that OO needed, which is the who makes it normal and how they define normal for everyone else. So in other words, I think it's a very clear win from CO. Get the prenup.
Thank you very much for this fine speech and for what was a fine debate. If it's all right for everyone, I think it's best if we also do OAs on Zoom. So I think it would be best if you leave the breakout room, we'll deliberate, and then we'll call you back. Thanks, everyone.